Hello, welcome to the Let's Talk Kids Health live show, episode 67. I'm Dr. Nerissa Bauer, your host. I'm a behavioral pediatrician and CEO of Let's Talk Kids Health. As you know, the concept of this show is to share information about behavioral health, parenting, and family wellness. Each week, I bring you topics and guests to help me advance this mission so that we can all talk together. Now, let us know that you're here by commenting, asking questions, and liking at any time. And in a little bit, your questions will be asked of my guest. Now, if you watch this on replay, which will be immediately available after the broadcast, please do leave a question or comment, but use hashtag replay. So that way we can go back in and look for those questions and comments and make sure that we answer them. And we're also going to be rebroadcasting each episode every Thursday night at 8 p.m. So share this episode with anyone you think who would benefit. And if you don't want to miss future episodes, or maybe check out the past ones, subscribe to my YouTube channel, NerissaBauerMD, and follow my blog Facebook page, Let's Talk Kids Health, and join my free parenting discussion group. Now, today's topic is all about Hunger Mealtime Games with Shellie King. Shellie is a pediatric speech language pathologist who has been working with kids and feeding goals for 23 years. Now, in 2019, she opened her second pediatric clinic that is more community-based and family-friendly. Her clinic continues to expand to include physical therapy, occupational therapy, speech therapy, and vocational training for teens and adults. So we're going to talk about that towards the end. Shellie, I am so excited to have you here. This is such an important topic. Thanks for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it. I love to share.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And for those of you who are watching, don't be shy. Tune in, say hello. Let us know that you're here too. And make sure, just feel free to put in your questions and comments at any time, and I will be asking them of my guest. All right. So without further ado, because I first of all, I thought the title of this episode was really great. I think when families think about feeding challenges, mealtime, it's like food fights and challenges all over. And so I'm really excited to chat with you. But in the moment, it can be really overwhelming for a lot of families, right? So could you help us, first of all, by defining what makes the difference between a pediatric feeding disorder versus picky eating, or just even just normal,
Yeah.
terrible twos, terrible threes,
Absolutely. So we know that all of our kids, as they grow into toddlerhood and they become more independent and more opinionated as they become toddlers, their adventurous eating might naturally tend to wean itself down. And as I'll talk in a little bit about research about some of that turns around by the age of 6. So kids eating will dip down and then it'll go back to more adventurous eating around the age of 6. But to truly define pediatric disorder versus picky eating, so a pediatric feeding disorder definition constitutes less than 20 foods and omitting 2 or more major food groups, and also pulling in some of that behavior at mealtime. They're not willing to try new foods. They might have a more adverse reaction than their peers. And some of the kids that I get, even when they're older, will have some really major nutritional impact on their feeding intake and nutrition. And then picky eating tends to be children that will eat about between 20 to 30 foods. They might have one food group that might be omitted. And they might be a little bit hesitant to try new foods, but they're maybe can be coerced into trying some foods, but they really will have a little bit of aversive reaction to trying new foods. And typically what we see is children will have one of these 2 groups, and it just really depends on the duration of how long it's going on for. So if the children are going through a picky eating phase, it's okay that they're going through a picky eating phase as long as the families continue to expose, to present new foods, and not just stay within that picky eating food choices. If it becomes more of a battle, more of a social impact, then it's time to get services from a professional. And so when we're looking at picky eating, sometimes if the duration is longer than 2 years, it's time to get help from a professional. So that's kind of that timeline when we look when it's good to refer.
Okay.
And then, of course, the problem feeders, there's a new definition that came out with the medical community on diagnosing an acute feeding disorder versus a chronic feeding disorder. And that 2-year timeline is really that definitive timeline of differentiating between those diagnoses.
Mm-hmm.
Because we can all go through a little bit of a hiccup, right? Every phase will pass. But if it's not passing, it's time to get some help. And I've been pulling some, I was telling you I had some great research to share because I get questions from the pediatricians a lot. When do we refer? Or a family might say, I've consulted with my pediatrician and they said that give it a little bit more time, they may grow out of it. So it's about communicating what all of those behaviors look like at mealtime. Are they really nutritionally deficient, even though they're still growing? Are they having some negative behaviors at mealtime that might be affecting their family mealtime or also their social, going to a birthday party or an overnight, and they can't do those things because it's such an impact. So some of the new research that came out just kind of states that about a quarter to a third of children will struggle with feeding issues in general, and about a third to a half will outgrow that. So that's about 36% will outgrow some of those feeding issues if you work through some of those. And overall, with just the general population of kids that are diagnosed as picky eaters, about 5% of those picky eaters will need some additional intervention. So it is a smaller percentage, so you really have to look at those numbers of how many foods they have. And I always tell families, start to think about what do they eat for breakfast and work through your day and write down your foods and see really what they're actually taking in. And some families are surprised at how many different foods their kids actually eat once you write it down.
Mm-hmm. No, that's a great tip. And
Mhm,
it's really interesting to me. I mean, I kind of wrote down and took my own notes about the difference there with those numbers, but
mhm.
2 years can feel
A
like a
long
very
time.
long time for families who, you think about like 3 meals a day and
Right.
wow. And if it's a struggle each and every
Yeah.
time, it can be
Mhm.
really stressful for
Well,
families.
and if it is really a struggle at every mealtime, then you really need to have that conversation with your pediatrician of saying, I'm ready to get some help. And
Yep.
even just to consult and ask your therapist, hey, what ideas can I implement? It doesn't necessarily mean you have to commit to a long duration of therapy, but if you can catch it on the back end and work ahead, what happens over a period of time, right, is we all food jag. So let's say I'm eating oatmeal every day for breakfast. I get a little tired of it. I might walk away from that food and come back in about 2 weeks. Well, what happens with kids with picky eating or feeding disorders is they will drop those foods and continue to drop those foods until they're older and they have 5 foods left that they're
Mm,
eating. And they're really stuck within this eating pattern. And the families will say, well, they used to eat cheese or they used to eat, cereal with milk. So what happens is these children have a hard time pulling that food back in. So again, if it's a really big struggle, then it's time to get a little bit of extra help because you're right, 2 years is so long to wait.
yeah. Can you define again what food jagging
Oh,
is?
yes.
Yes.
So food jagging is just where you will naturally just drop a food because you eat it so often and you'll drop it and then you'll pick it back up again. So
Mhm.
food jagging is that dropping off those foods and then reintroducing them back again. And usually we'll reintroduce it within 2 weeks. It's really important with kids with feeding issues to try to reintroduce that food within 2 months to try to continue to represent it again and again
Mhm.
so that they'll pull it back into their diet before they drop it
Okay.
longer than that.
Okay.
Mhm.
And it's really important too, especially with peds cases that, I mean, the adults are the ones responsible for putting food
Mhm.
in front of them. So this is a really
Yes.
great tip in sort of
Mhm.
making sure that those foods are periodically reintroduced.
Yes.
Hmm.
Mhm.
Okay.
Definitely.
So I'm curious, and again, those of you who are watching, don't be shy. If you've got questions, observations, comments, just post them. But so, what can families do with their kids at home right away to help them get
Mhm.
involved in mealtime? Let's say it's a picky eater,
Mhm.
and all of that. I mean, like, what approaches would you suggest to these families?
Well, I definitely think there are a wide variety of approaches we can use. And it just kind of depends on reading your child, finding what successes, what brings them joy, what interests them. So I will give you a wide range of suggestions, and you can pick and choose with your child's personality where they fit
Mhm.
and where they'll be most successful. So some of my children, and I think this is a challenge after COVID when we don't take our children grocery shopping with us anymore, or we may click and collect. But even if you're shopping online or if you're shopping in the store, asking your child to help with meal planning and involve the whole family. So maybe there's three siblings and our parents asking in meal planning, what would you like for a meal this week? To include them, or asking what new food would you like to try this week, or take them grocery shopping with you to choose something. So some kids get interested in having that role and responsibility of having a little buy-in of what their opinion is. So that's one thing. And even if they say, let's say they eat a ton of mac and cheese and they say, I want to have mac and cheese at the meal time, make sure that you praise that. Yes, that's your favorite meal. Let's go ahead and meal plan around. What else would you like to have at that meal? So then we can start meal planning and picking other new things that that child might like. Maybe they are wanting to try watermelon or something. We can add that to their meal. And then the next week, another sibling gets to choose the meal plan for the week, one meal for the week. So you can try that as a strategy. You can also, of course, help with cooking. Some kids are interested, some kids are not. And it even can just be the exposure of smelling and touching and cutting and interacting and watching everybody else at the table enjoy that food, or having a little bit of buy in to what's being prepared. Again, sometimes depending on the level of your child, sometimes that works and sometimes it doesn't. But I also feel another really important thing for children that are more severe um, problem feeders is sometimes they won't even come into the kitchen. If they're kind of scanning and they look and see, oh, mom is making that, and they're already getting nervous and anxious before the food's even on the table. Or if
Mm,
somebody serves a dish on the table, that child is not willing to come to the table. So I always remind families, let's look at your plate and look at how you're making up your plate. Maybe you have 80% of a preferred food for your child. And I always have, again, let's use mac and cheese. If that child has a mac and cheese preference, you want to put 80% of that dish on that plate of macaroni and cheese. And then you might have 15% of a food that they don't hate, that they don't love. I call it a so-so food. And then I may have, if it's a meal that we're trying a new food, it might be a maybe later food, which I think we've talked about this before. Instead of saying it's a no thank you bite, I say maybe later we'll try it again another time. So
mhm.
when you're looking at your makeup of your plate, that child knows that when I come to the table, I'm going to have my macaroni and cheese, my safe food. And then they also get the exposure of all the other items on the plate. So that's really important for those really severe cases where they might need a little bit more baby stepping into the realm of mealtime. And then also, too, if your child, some children won't eat off of their plate if there's a new food on their plate.
Mhm.
So then you just take a little tiny tea set plate or a smaller dish, and you can set it next to the main plate a little bit further off. And so the child knows that the new food will sit on that plate near them. And then eventually we'll work on taking it and putting it on our plate and baby step some of those. And so we have this wide range of participation in our meal times and trying to feel that your child's tiny successes are going to be praised along the way. So I've always been told that you can't make kids eat, sleep, or go to the bathroom. So you
Mhm.
have to have a buy in, right?
Yep.
And then you have your range of your toddler behaviors. And then in my big kids that are 8, 9, and 10, I'm going to have some great conversation with them about what do you want to work on? What's really important to you? You know, I had a little boy who wanted to buy something from the baseball concession stand because that was important when all of his friends went up to go buy something. He wanted to buy something. Or a little girl who wanted to pretend like she was eating something at the birthday party but didn't have to eat all of it. But we talked about stepping through those anxious moments for her
Mhm.
and having that buy-in. So when you have all of these range of ages, range of, you know, picky eating to problem feeding, you really have to have that buy-in and building on those successes. So I will tell families too, let's talk about how we're going to baby step through all of these steps that lead up to feeding. There's many approaches out there from other providers that, you know, have all the different steps to mealtime feeding. Um, and so maybe we might touch it. Maybe we might cut it. Maybe we might take it, give it a lick. Maybe I might take a bite and spit it out and try it again later, the maybe later bite.
Mhm.
And so as we're baby stepping through all of these pieces, don't always think of taking a bite and swallowing it down is a success. All of these tiny little steps lead up to that moment. And think about when little babies are learning to eat. You're eating there with your plate, and the babies are looking and watching and they're leaning forward. You want to pay attention to all those body language pieces and praise them. Mommy sees that you're watching me eat this. You know, I really describe it, right? It's crunchy, it's salty, it tastes a little sour. Start to put some labeling words on your foods so that your kids can describe what they like, what they don't like.
Mhm.
Mhm.
I think too, what this is great, by the way. This is really practical suggestions. Can I just clarify two things?
Sure.
One is when you said, look at your plate, 80% of the preferred food should be on there
Mhm.
so that the child can know that when they come to the table, there's something there that they can partake in.
Right. Mhm.
I'm thinking about like, so does that mean then when we're meal planning, do we always have to cook to the child's
Mhm.
tastes? You know, like there's that balance there. We don't want to
There
necessarily
is a
become
balance.
sous chefs there or like,
Yes.
short order cooks, but like how do you kind of navigate that with families if they don't always want to be making mac and cheese?
Agreed.
Yeah.
Yes. And so typically, what I tell families is as we're chugging along and we're working on things and we're starting to look at things differently, and I always like to take tacos, for example.
Mhm.
And this is what my family is like as well. Everybody likes their taco differently, right? Some like a soft shell, some like a hard shell, some like the chips with just the cheese and meat. So start thinking about deconstructing your meal times so that you're cooking one meal. And let's say you're cooking, let's say ground beef. Let's say your child loves hamburger meat. So you're going to ground a hamburger meat, or you can take your hamburger meat, right, and kind of cook it in the same dish. And before you add the seasoning for the tacos, you pull out a little bit of ground meat or a ground, you know, ground up patty,
Mhm.
and then add your taco seasoning. And then maybe you can pull together a little piece of the meal. Or instead of, let's say your child has, really likes chicken nuggets, let's say. Maybe one night your family makes chicken nuggets, and then sometimes we can serve it in a salad, right, for the mom and dad. Maybe we can have throw on a grilled piece of chicken, but we can also have the other chicken, pull apart the lettuce. Maybe the cheese on the salad could be placed aside. So we talk about deconstructing meals all the time. So you're making one dish, one item for everybody.
Mhm.
Or, like, for example, let's say you're making pasta, spaghetti. One likes it with no sauce and one likes it with sauce. So you just pull some of that out and meal plan around that. Or if your child likes watermelon, everybody at mealtime has the opportunity to eat some watermelon,
Mhm.
either as a dessert or part of their meal. But it's something that's there, and you can kind of work through and cycle through some of your meal planning based on that because it is exhausting cooking separately, especially if you have two feeders in the family that are a little particular. Mhm.
Yes, thank you for that. Thanks for clarifying
Mhm.
that. And then also I was thinking too about picky eating and sometimes like sensory issues. Like what if they're touching?
Yeah.
Like what are some advice or strategies there for like families of kids who just don't want to see them touching even at
Yes.
all?
So a lot of times what I do with my kiddos, I always, you know, you brought up earlier, 3 meals a day, 7 days a week, that's not including snacks. It's a lot of meal prep,
Yep.
all, battles during the week. And so if you want to have, I always call it a working meal. So if you have one working meal a day where you know that you're not running around, you're not hangry after school. Sometimes too, I will have families pull their mealtime after school when their kid is really, really hungry. They might have had a little bit of lunch, maybe their meds are starting to wear off
Hmm.
and they're starting to get a little bit more hungry. So we'll have a mealtime after school and then a snack at dinner time where the pressure to eat is a little less.
Okay.
So if we're looking at the picky eating and that sensory, is we will pick one working meal a day. We'll go ahead and introduce a new food. And a lot of times I talk a lot about how friends can be food can be friends when they go down into your belly. Some are friends, some are not friends. So apple and peanut butter are friends. Carrots and peanut butter can be friends. Graham crackers and Nutella, things that taste good together.
Uh-huh.
So those kids that don't like things touching, I work on taking some things that they really like if they'll eat a peanut butter sandwich and apples by themselves, and we'll start working on those foods going together
Hmm.
in very, very small increments.
Okay.
You know, you might take a bite of apple and then take a bite of peanut butter and chew it up in your mouth together and swallow it down. Or you might have a lot of peanut butter with a little bit of a tiny apple, just depending on the child. So, those kids that don't like things touching on their plate, you might have them spread peanut butter on an apple to give to their sibling. And that's their exposure, the tolerance of the items touching.
Hmm.
So then you really want to just, again, take where your child's successes are and building on those positive interactions.
Yes, I love that.
Mhm.
Thank you. And we do have a question from a viewer, but let me go ahead first and ask this other question because I think it might answer some of it, but I will then put the viewer's question up.
Sure.
Okay. So, what strategies can parents use to decrease anxiety related to mealtime? Because again,
Mm,
some of that, the touching, the like
yes.
watching and scanning, what's mom making? I'm not sure. I
Mhm.
mean, that could all be some of that anticipatory anxiety around meals. It
Yes.
could also, and then also we're talking too, like parents come to the table. Like if it's been happening for a long
Mhm.
time, oh my gosh, another meal, a working meal where we have to,
Yes.
do this. So there's also that component of parent anxiety too. Can you talk
Mhm.
about that?
Yes. And I think that a lot of the families that I work with will tell me that if they start reframing their mindset a little bit of what food interactions successes look like,
Yes.
then you tend to grab onto positive thinking, drives positive behaviors
Hmm.
in many aspects of our life. So I feel like if you start to reset your mind to think about what are those tiny little steps for eating and interactions and verbally comment back and narrate for the child. I really enjoy that you are helping me cut up the fruit for the family. I really appreciate that. And I like how you're touching it and smelling it, and it smells really sweet. Um, and then I also think too is some of these kids have a really true fear with some of these food interactions, and it's not easy and it's really hard work. And so again, taking their successes and like I said earlier, if they really know that they're really hungry, give them a bulk food to eat that is really easy for them because they're hungry and it's really hard to work through some of those foods. And I also feel like not kind of every kid is different. Some kids like to know ahead of time. Like I had one mom that would meal plan her entire month of her
Wow.
foods. That was easy for her, not for me.
Not for me.
And knowing what you're going to eat ahead of time is a little hard, right? We
Yes.
change our mind a little bit. So every kid is different. So sometimes, let's say in the morning, if you have some extra time in the morning, and I will have a visual chart for my kids, either pictures or words, and I'll say, what are we going to have for dinner tonight? I'm going to pick out of my food bank of I'm going to do this food and this food and this food so that they know all day that that's easy for them to do. Some kids don't want to talk about it ahead of time. And so I think that also depends is how prepped and how prepared is your kid. And sometimes as parents, we fly by the seat of our pants as
Mhm.
we go along, but just that might not be a meal for you to, come to a working meal on. So just kind of pick and choose those easy times. And also just recognizing that it is super successful if your child is tasting, maybe scraping it on their teeth with an apple just to get the taste and not a lot of texture. And a lot of families, when they start with therapy, I'll ask the kids, let's try a new flavored potato chip. And the mom's kind of looking at me, like, we're going to expand our potato chip variety. But it's about having the confidence to try something new,
Mhm.
to know I can do it and what those steps are. So do that within a safe realm of a safe food that is going to be successful. And I always tell my kids, I'm not going to give you something that's way too hard. We're going to baby step through this and we're going to work through this.
Yeah.
Again, just to validate some of their fears, but also give them a boundary to work within, right? You
Yep.
said it was your job to bring the food to the table. And, a lot of times I'll ask my parents, what do you want to work on? What do you find will be successful for your family?
Mhm.
And one family said, we eat pasta all the time. So I said, okay, let's prioritize that to make your life a little easier.
Yes.
So I think it's just, again, gaining positive verbal reinforcement for positive behavior, you
Mhm.
know.
Yeah, I love the idea, and I mean, I think that's genius in terms of at least going through the motions, the process, introducing them to this is
Mhm,
what we're going to do for other foods eventually, but like
mhm.
starting with that safe bet, you know,
Texture,
I
that
just I
safe
love that.
texture, yeah.
Yeah.
Or even trying a new brand of
Hmm.
potato chips. Let's say
Yep.
it's really hard for them to do a
Yeah.
different flavor. Let's try a new brand.
So a comment here. Yes, they ask what's for dinner, and if they don't like it, the
Yeah,
moans and the groans begin,
yeah.
and the dinner stress begins. So how do we
Uh-huh.
as parents respond to these moans and groans? And I hate that for dinner.
Yes, before you even get to the table.
Yeah.
Yes. And just know too, I feel a lot of my kids will do that as well. It's, just hard to please everybody.
Hmm.
But again, telling families if this is a child that's a picky eater or a problem feeder, just kind of saying what do you feel that you really want for dinner tonight? Pick one thing that the child will eat that, like, ahead of time. Ask and come up with a food list, right? What are our really favorite? A lot of times I'll divide out my food lists into my favorite foods, my so-so foods, and my maybe later foods.
Hmm.
So really come up with some foods, and my so-so foods are foods that kids are willing to try. They don't love it, but we talk about how it's nutritionally sound. So some kids really love to eat green beans. Some kids really don't like to eat green beans, but we know that we need to eat them because it makes our body healthy. And I'll say we have to eat things to nutritionally feed our bodies, but we don't love it. I always don't love eating salad, but I know it's good for my body to eat some good nutritional food. And it fills up our belly and it helps our belly not to be hungry later, right?
Hmm.
We talk about that whole process.
Hmm.
So, I would say ahead of time, come up with some of those foods. And you could tell your child, well, that's going to go in our maybe later section, or that's something that we're going to have in our so so section. And so if it's a food that's in our so so section, I will have the kids try 5 bites because I know that they'll eat it. Not that I'm going to have this definitive amount, but that's just about how many pieces of that food I'll put on the plate. So
Hmm.
visually, it's lots of my easy fill my belly food, and then 5 bites of green beans that I know that they'll eat them. Or like, let's say they really like mandarin oranges. So we'll have mandarin oranges on our plate, but we'll also offer the rest of the family mandarin oranges as well. So I would say with the moans and groans, and just say, I hear that you don't really want that for dinner tonight. Validate their feelings. Go back to your list and you can direct them and say, you show me what you want off your list for today, and you can put that on the table for dinner tonight, and have them have a little bit of that buy in and have enough to share with the rest of the family. Again, to validate, lay those boundaries down of that's what we're going to have for dinner. And then if you want to meal pick it apart ahead of time, you can.
Hmm.
If it's not a meal that you can pick apart, then they can show you where on their plate that food
It's
will
going to
go.
go.
That maybe later that we'll just try a little bit, but we're not going to have a big bulk amount of that,
Mm, okay.
and start to lay down those boundaries.
Yeah, so hopefully that answered your question. That gave you some good ideas. Let us know. And then I have this other question,
Mm-hmm.
a question about vomiting. My
Mm-hmm.
son used to vomit all the time after eating when he was younger. It doesn't happen often now that he's 8, but every once in a while it does. So
Mm-hmm.
never understood why this happens. Is this more a sensory issue, a sensory gag reflex? What is this?
Yeah, some kids, that's a loaded question that I have lots of questions for.
Yes.
That might require some assistance to get an evaluation done from a professional. Because sometimes, parents will ask me often, is this something that's psychological, or do they gag? And then some kids, once they gag, that gag reflex just comes along with vomiting.
Yep.
So, but I definitely think that there could be more answers to that question. So I would say go ahead and get a referral for a therapist, just to kind of get some suggestions and pick through some things.
Yeah, and I would also add to that too, as a trained as a pediatrician, there's a lot of underlying reasons for that. I mean,
Mhm,
obviously, food allergy, stress, and anxiety, but there's other things
mhm.
too that we want
Yes.
to rule in and rule out. And then,
Mhm.
some kids also. I don't think that this was necessarily where the person who posted this was going, but there's also this severe fear of vomiting,
Yes.
right?
Mhm.
A metaphobia too, so sometimes some kids also don't want to eat because of that as
Yes.
well.
Mhm.
Yes, I never know if it's physical or
Yes.
psychological. So that I would really recommend,
Mhm.
going back to the pediatrician to start, and then maybe getting a referral
Mhm.
for additional workup on
And
that.
also just making the comment about sensory feeding issues. When
Hmm.
you start to regulate a lot of the sensory systems, you're left with that residual behavior. So a lot of it can be sensory, and it can also be psychological, because once you peel the layers away and you address some of those pieces, you have to continue and see it through to the end, because once the sensory is cleaned up and more regulated, then you're left with some of the behavior,
Hmm.
and then you tweak that.
Yeah. And I would say
Mhm.
too, it's a good idea to just get it investigated, especially
Oh,
because it
yes.
doesn't happen all the time anymore. But again, for a child who's 8, and if it's happening at
Mhm.
school or in public, I mean, that also
Yes.
could be hard for him.
Yeah.
So, okay. This has been great. So I'm going to just recap some of the big things, and I'm going to ask for you to share additional just resources or where we can find you. So some of the things that kind of stood out to me was, first of all, parents keep a record of foods that they do eat. You might be surprised at the kind of just how big that menu is when you actually take the
Mhm.
time to sit down and write it out. Involve the child in meal planning and cooking, depending on your
Mhm.
child and their level of interest. And then looking at the plate, putting 80% of the preferred food there, and then grouping the rest as so-so and maybe later. I like that. You
Mhm.
talked about food jagging, um, and then some of that anxiety around food and some strategies there.
Mhm.
So this has been a really great discussion. I love the deconstructing meals, because I think
Mhm.
too that while it takes a little extra to kind of think through, like as you're kind of combining all the spices and all these other
Mhm.
things, it's just so much easier than preparing two separate
Right.
meals.
Mhm. Mhm.
So yeah, I love that. And then lastly, where can people go to find more information about you if they're local to Indiana, if they want to
Sure.
see you, or even just
Mhm.
connect with you on social media?
Yes. So I am in Fishers, Indiana,
Uh-huh.
and we take most major insurance. Kidsindiana.com is my website, and on there, there's a link to contact me.
Mhm.
So you can send me an email, and then the Kids Inc. Ideas is my Instagram, and then my Facebook is Kids Inc. I try to keep everybody updated as often as I can. Um, I did want to share a little bit about my new Voc Rehab program and my new clinic that I just moved into.
Yes,
It's so much bigger.
congratulations.
Thank you. And it's really about a sense of community and a feeling of belonging. I really want families to have easy access to information. I want to try to streamline all of our lives to be easier. Don't we all want that? And so the new clinic will have a modified grocery store, some take and bake meals. We'll have a coffee shop in the waiting room, and then a nice rentable kitchen to have food trucks come in and really work on renting the kitchen space with the intention and purpose of training for vocational rehab for teens and adults with disabilities. So we can really coexist in the space. The nonprofit is called Together Employability Aims for More. So team and kids can really work together to try and help each other out and streamline things a little bit better to help each other out in our busy lives. So I'm
Yeah.
really excited about it.
I mean, I am excited for you. I think when I first met you, you talked about this, and I was like,
Mhm,
"Oh my goodness!" Like that to have that vision is wonderful. And once the nonprofit does launch, we
mhm,
will update our show notes and make sure to
mhm,
connect everybody to that if you're interested in learning more. Thank you for the
mhm.
work that you do in the
Thank
community,
you.
bringing your
Mhm.
expertise to this topic. I also find that when I talk with you, you're very soothing and calm, and which is, I think, lovely, especially around this topic where it can be really
It's so
stressful.
stressful.
Yes.
Mhm.
So I love your
Yes.
kind of your approach and your
Thank
demeanor.
you. Mhm. And I always like to tell families, like if there's, a small parent support group where I can talk to families, I am always willing to share information at local organizations. So
Yes.
I can do that as well.
Yes, Shellie did a great job for us. She came into our Teach Me ADHD community last week with also Dr. Kieran Palmer,
Mhm.
where we addressed some specific community member questions around ADHD,
Mhm.
food fights, and struggles too.
Mhm.
So, thank you for doing that, and thank you for this work and taking the time to educate and answer some questions. So,
Yeah.
remember, this episode will be rebroadcast on Thursday in the parenting discussion group. But if you know someone who would really benefit from watching this episode, or if you catch this on replay and have additional questions, please type hashtag replay, put your question or comment, and I will be looking for those. And then if I can't answer them, I will ask Shellie, and
Yep.
then I will get back to you. Because again, the purpose of these shows are to answer questions and
Mhm.
get families talking around these topics. So
Yeah.
again, I really appreciate you, Shellie. Um, and then next week, my guest is Lafayette Mitchell, who has not been, who has been, is not, sorry, I'm going to start over. Lafayette Mitchell is a good friend and is always so kind to come. And she comes in frequently to my Teach Me ADHD community, but she is going to be joining us on on this show here. She will be talking about a fresh approach to parenting children with ADHD. So you do not want to miss this. My discussions with her, I mean, we could talk for hours, but we will do our best to answer questions from the guests. And then also, always remember, if you have a specific guest or topic that you'd like to learn about, please don't hesitate to contact me at Dr. Nerissa at letstalkkidshealth.org. Follow my YouTube, Facebook, Instagram. You can DM me there and send me show ideas or guests as well. And then again, tonight, or actually in a few hours, I have a live author chat with Dr. Victoria Dunkley. That was our book club read. And again, I'm just going to show this to you. It's called Reset Your Child's Brain, a 4-week plan to end meltdowns, raise grades, and boost social skills by reversing the effects of electronic screen time. So don't miss out. It's only going to be showing in the parenting discussion group. If you have any questions, please try to log on live so you can ask. But if you can't make it and want me to ask for you, go ahead and leave questions in the parenting discussion group, and I will comb through there right before I go live. All right, so that's it for now. Thanks so much, Shellie, again
Thanks for
for
having me. I
coming.
appreciate it.
Yeah, and keep up the great work. And people, if you guys have more questions, post them and we'll get to you,
Mhm.
okay? And we'll see you all next week. Thanks. Or maybe hopefully in
Thanks.
2 hours.